right now, when we talk about psychedelics, we're almost talking about at the same level as people are talking about cancer therapy, which is immunotherapy. Something about activating the body's own systemic mechanisms to create healing. In the same way, psychedelics are also doing that. And so in the psychotherapy, you become more free to follow whatever the MDMA invokes, whatever's coming out of the patient. So you trust that, and we've seen that in ketamine therapy, is that if we just kind of don't try to force on like a rigid structure, where the patient's material takes them becomes their journey, and it kind of unfolds in a way that the psyche is ready for.
Welcome to the Two Curious MD podcast. I'm Dr. Alya Ahmad.
And I'm Dr. Suraiya Rahman.
With the wisdom from holistic, alternative, and these conventional medicines, we are here to challenge the status quo.
We're curious about the connectivity and complexity between diverse fields of knowledge as they relate to consciousness, chronic illness, mental health, resilience, and beyond.
Learning more about the art and science of healing, or listening to stories of extraordinary healing. You're in the right place. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Two Curious MDs podcast, where medicine is more than science. It's story, art, connection, and integration. This is a space for the curious. And today, I'm going to put Simi on the spot.
Oh, boy.
She is in the limelight, and the lights are shining, and she's on stage. And she's going to talk to us about the retreat that we're planning, ancestral healing, and all the things that she does that amazes us.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you just kind of put me on the spot. We had a guest, cancel, which sometimes gives us the opportunity to be well-dressed on a Sunday afternoon and ready for the camera. And so Alya, ask you a question. I'm happy. I am sitting with some cards. So I pulled the card today, and maybe I should start by reading that, because that can maybe give us a little bit of calling in our intuitions. So I love using this animal spirit deck. It can sometimes be spooky. Gives us the swan card, which is really pretty.
Nice. Can I see? Yeah. Can you see? Can I show it up in here?
It's the water element, and it's the swan. And I think it really will speak to this element that we're in right now, trying to flow with the moment, right? And sometimes when unexpected things happen, somebody cancels, plans change, things didn't turn up the way you thought it would, there's an opportunity for creativity. So the swan card today shows us that there's effortless creativity, a sensitive mystic, and elegant power. The swan represents heightened creativity. In Hindu mythology, the goddess Saraswati, the embodiment of language, creativity, and artistry, rides on the back of this graceful creature. The swan is ready to take us there, to the fluid realm of writing, creating, and reflecting. This potent and healing energy is not to be taken for granted or taken lightly. When the swan card appears, your soul is calling for attention, for solo time. An inner voice is waiting to be heard, an inner vision likely to be revealed. When in balance, infinite creative power. When out of balance, agitated, snippy, or lacking vision, I can relate, to bring it to balance. Solo time and writing, right? Solo time and writing. And so what does a retreat mean? A retreat is solo time. And you can do a retreat by yourself or with other healers like yourself or a friend. And I've always loved doing retreats. So for me, this retreat that we're planning is just a very special treat, another level too. Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to bring up what we talk about a lot, which is ancestral healing and generational trauma. And I want to bring this up because in the times that we're in currently, it seems to be that we are still cycling through the same generational trauma that's just is perpetual. And it makes me kind of sad that when we were at the MAPS conference, we talked about zero net trauma.
I remember that.
And now we're talking about trauma and recurrence of trauma that perpetually persists. And this has to do with not just what's happening in the world these days, but what's happening within families and what's happening within the infrastructure of our human condition and our own story to why we do this work. And we don't really get to talk about that too much. And I thought we'd just take this opportunity to really bring that to light. So what are your thoughts on what's happening in the world and what's happening within that infrastructure of healing?
Big questions, right? So I think we're talking about the reality of early 2026 when we don't really know what's happening with global peace, global conflict, global economic collapse. When we dig a little bit deeper, it looks like there's this bigger story underlying. There's these forces that have been operational for 2,000 years in the Middle East. Right? And they come from these, you call them ideologies, you call them story of origin. It's who they are. It's like, this land is ours. No, this land is ours. We originated from them. And you see the fight of two brothers, basically, because when you talk about all the Abrahamic religions, they have one root, and they split off into three different perspectives, alternative paths. And so we find that there are rifts where brother against brother, like between our cultures, your culture and my culture, Alya, is like...
And just for the audience sake, I want the audience to really just ground in on where our backgrounds are, and specifically yours, because Dubai is where you grew up. Mm-hmm. It's very dear to you because there's a lot of history there, as what you're describing. I lived in Dubai. I lived in Abu Dhabi for 10 years and came back. And it's a center point of the world, I believe, in a lot of ways, because, of course, a lot happens in that region and continues to infiltrate into so many parts of our work. So back to now what you were saying.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of unavoidable. That. You're right. Like, we are of the generation in which we've kind of seen this divide from different sides, right? Because of the outsider status, right? We're not embedded within one culture. We've kind of had third culture, fourth culture experiences where you can really see sometimes that the same conflict is seen differently from both sides. And when you see that, you recognize that, it's really about the story, right? It's a story that people are living. It's what gives them meaning. And when things get to the point of those red hot button topics, religion, identity, belonging, those are places where there's ready kindling to be lit on fire, right? As happens in even any families, right? You have two brothers, they grow up, they have their own families. There's always going to be something underlying. And you recognize that, there's going to be things that we can lob across each other's, across the divide, and that can get people riled up. Or we can try to understand each other's perspective and see that there's also opportunity for coming together and understanding. So I grew up in Dubai, you're right, and I grew up in a time when it was before the big kind of buildings came up. And so it was the late 70s, early 80s. My parents were physicians. We were on this compound in Sharjah, right next to the beach. It was this beautiful place where there were doctors from all over the South Asian countries, South India, Pakistan, all parts of India. And my parents were from Bangladesh, and it was just kind of, everybody's coming together and everybody's working, and there's Arabs and there's Egyptians and there's, Persians, and we're all trying to get along and understand each other. And to me, I felt like I saw the best of humanity as a child in that respect, where we were all inviting each other to each other's homes and sharing our food and sharing our culture. And so I got like an insight into this is what Lebanese family life is like. This is what Egyptian family life is like. And this is what, what people's stories are, Palestinians. So it was just like a very interesting place to grow up, where you see that Islam is not one big thing. It's many, many different versions of it, and everybody's speaking it in a different tongue. I mean, I think that's one of the things that people forget, is that at the heart of Saudi Arabia, where Mecca is, if you go there, and you're circumambulating around the Kaaba, you hear so many versions of what people are saying when they are, chanting. And it's beautiful. Like, there's a moment of recognizing unity, right? Which I think is what, when we scratch below the surface of political divides, we get to the part that all these religions are talking about unity. All these religions are talking about oneness and of humility, right? And Islam, submission is such a great idea. Like, the Jews and the Muslims, they speak almost the same language. It's salam and shalom, So it's just like, if for us to be in this moment where we are now looking at a Middle East that's throwing bombs at each other, is to look at a conflict created out of the kindling between two brothers, right? And external forces, because they're sitting on the biggest pot of oil that's easy to tap.
Yeah.
So Yeah, so the Middle East,
Oil prices have gone up.
right.
Tension is everywhere. People are worried about even just surviving and water and access.
Its desalination plants
just
could be
resources.
taken out by drones, and
Yeah.
millions of people in the Middle East, some of our friends and family members, are going to be scrambling, and we know what that's like. To hold both and is like a really big thing, but I think that's where we're at here is.
And it's collateral damage everywhere you look.
Yeah.
Everywhere you look, it's collateral damage. Like, how many people are being brought into this conflict with or without their consent? We're talking about the military, we're talking about resources, we're talking about money, we're talking about, human lives.
Yeah.
We're talking about neighbors, we're talking about the whole world and our planet.
Yeah.
Do we even think about the environmental effect of war on the planet?
Exactly.
The destruction. My husband does TNT, and part of his work in water and environmental engineering has been remediation of soil with TNT in it.
Wow.
With detonating, nitrous.
Yeah.
And
dangerous.
He's spent years working on that. So that there's so many layers of collateral damage that we're talking about.
Yeah. When I was growing up there, the seas of the Straits of Hormuz were absolutely crystal clear, emerald green. You could see fish in it from a boat. It was just magical, and now they're putting mines in it. So, right now, as we're doing the work we do and we're trying to understand how can we meet this moment without getting, pulled in by the negativity of it, pulled in by the destruction of it, because I think what we're learning, you and me, from dealing with people who have trauma, right, is that trauma needs to be processed. Trauma can't be passed on to the next generation. We cannot allow that to happen because it can easily be passed on to the next generation. And I think that's what's happening. In Iran, when the school that was bombed, we just passed on trauma to another generation. And our kids are going to have to deal with the consequences of what just happened, right? Everybody's versions of reality have now encompassing, and we're not stopping it. That's the thing, nobody's stopping it. So with that, as more trauma is moving us away from the dream that Rick Doblin had at MAPS 2023 of net zero trauma by 2030, I think what it forces us psychedelic practitioners to do is actually double down, because we know that the amount of trauma being caused has actually accelerated just in the last few weeks. And the consequences of it, we know, are going to be devastating. And we know that we have the tools like MDMA, like ketamine, like psilocybin, ibogaine, to really stop the consequences of this trauma from manifesting in our bodies, in our environments, in our children's bodies. I think as pediatricians, we are also dealing with multiple assaults on various fronts. Vaccines being taken away means that more children will die. The Epstein files means that more children have been damaged than we were ever aware of. And I think in psychedelic healing, when we deal with people who have depression, and then we notice that, oh, wait a second, has anybody ever asked an ACEs score from this person? And they do their ACEs score, which is the Adverse Childhood Event Score, and lo and behold, it's across the board showing you that this child didn't have enough to eat, didn't have one person in their life to care for them. Somebody abused them. They had a parent who was, addicted. All those things that add up to what you're talking about, which is that intergenerational trauma and how our healthcare system is not equipped to handle it. When you talk about the integrative medical model of how we can support a healing nervous system with, testing, with targeted precision support of that metabolic system, and that everybody's metabolic system is different, and everybody's trauma is different, and everybody's temperament and lifestyle and all of that is different, and how that needs kind of this multimodal ability to diagnose, treat and manage. I think this is where we're at with psychedelic medicine, in the way that I've learned in the last year of all these conversations we've had. And I'm really excited to kind of support other healers who are working in this field, because I think because we know that these modalities work and we see them work in our patients every day, we have to give ourselves permission to also use these modalities to heal, And I think because the opposite of that, or what's at stake, is that we have for example, in this country, a healthcare system and a healthcare workforce that is being decimated with traumatic, you talk about nurses being attacked, the pit, I think, is doing a fantastic job of showing the consequences of this breakdown. And we have to support, heal, so we can continue to hold what's coming, right? And what's happening. So with that in mind, I have an outline for our first pilot Mindwala retreat. And I'm going to just be talking about how I like to take what's known.
Can I just pause you for a
sure.
second before we do that? Because I think it's important what you just said for our audience as we move on to talk a little bit about why we're doing the retreat and the importance of that retreat as resiliency. And I think when you mentioned the ACEs, and I had a patient who is a veteran and was at the verge of, has a lot of existential kind of crisis because of what's happening in the world. But this just added on to the active PTSD, not post, but active PTSD. And I told her, I understand that this is really, really challenging for you at this time, as it is for so many people, and it's palpable. You can feel it, see it in every which way. First, a few months ago, you had to search for these things like this, and yet now it's everywhere. And really, what it comes down to is continuing to heal yourself, because you're building on that resiliency that you have, that trauma that you've experienced. And this is where you mentioned speaking to a bigger audience here in psychedelics. This is where connection, this is where really listening to each other, really truly listening and learning about each other from perspective, from story, and using the science of healing to actively heal. No, we don't have to wait. We can actively heal as we do this, because this is a long path ahead of us. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I really love that we are walking this path together, and also inviting others and finding others who trust us with, holding the space and creating the conditions for healing, because we've been, honing that practice. It's a daily practice. And there's a lot to offer to each other. And, you're talking about evidence, this paper that I'm reading that's really fascinating to me about, when you talk about like psychotherapy and like MDMA or ketamine, right? And I think when we talk about trauma, the most of the research has been done in MDMA. So sometimes I might be talking about MDMA, but the only legal aspect that we can work with right now is ketamine. And there are some mechanisms that kind of bridge over, as we see, because ketamine is also used in PTSD. But some of the papers that are coming out are asking the question of like, okay, so we have psychotherapies like prolonged exposure and CBT therapy that we know work in PTSD. How do you frame MDMA with that? Is it about putting in another element into a process that's all about the psychotherapy and has that structured ability of the psychotherapy, and the MDMA, and you kind of sprinkle that on? Or is it that the MDMA itself adds a different element to how the psychotherapeutic process works, and therefore we can't just put that layer onto the process? We kind of have to see, okay, what elements of it serve the self-healing mechanism, because MDMA activates the body's own internal healing mechanism. So right now, when we talk about psychedelics, we're almost talking about at the same level as people are talking about cancer therapy, which is immunotherapy. Something about activating the body's own systemic mechanisms to create healing. In the same way, psychedelics are also doing that. And so in the psychotherapy, you become more free to follow whatever the MDMA invokes, whatever's coming out of the patient. So you trust that, and we've seen that in ketamine therapy, is that if we just kind of don't try to force on like a rigid structure, where the patient's material takes them becomes their journey, and it kind of unfolds in a way that the psyche is ready for. So in some ways, it's trusting that means that the person is ready for that material at that time, because otherwise it kind of wouldn't come at that time. And our job becomes about maybe making that safe enough to look at, and accompanying and kind of supporting that unfolding that needs to happen. And in my mind, what then brought up was when you do this medicine in a group, right? Because that's one of the formats that's coming up really strongly as a signal in the data as well, that one-on-one therapy is great. It's high intensity. It needs 2 practitioners, sometimes even 3. But when you do a group model, there's actually an added layer, like the sum of the parts become greater than the whole. What becomes available is more. And what we see from that, I think, is that with the psychedelic experience in a group, that individual identity starts to just shift a little bit into a collective identity. So you kind of see an identity shift happening, even just in the group, right? And when we do group process over weeks, yes, that happens, right? The individual identity starts to become part of a group. In MDMA and psilocybin, and especially in ketamine too, that happens within the one session, And what I think that brings is that then you're part of the collective intelligence. You're kind of tapping into the wisdom of the collective, of all 4 people, let's say, if 4 people are in a healing container. And that's very powerful, especially when you have the ability to invoke each individual person's kind of ancestry, their own healing powers, their own capabilities and knowledge and wisdom, right? And especially when you have other things between them happening. Let's say you have a group of people who are healers, but also mothers. Or you have a group of people who are healers and mothers, and they all have children who are about to leave the nest. They're kind of stepping into their own next stage of their life. So that kind of also is something to think about when you're designing a healing container, is like, what is coming up? What are some of the layers that are showing up? And just paying attention to that, just like an arising, and putting language to that can kind of activate some of those elements, right? So
I also want to bring up this idea that with the recent kind of publications on this, where group therapy and individual therapy was provided to Jews and Arab Israeli citizens. This is published after 2023 in October, I think, is how ketamine and how treatments like this can really help the community at large, even enemies, sitting side by side and sitting with each other's story and letting down kind of that default system of protection or barriers and really speak to their true essence of their human condition, which is where psychedelics really enhance. Like you said, that brings up that element of what's good, the immunotherapy, that's treating that human spirit without all of the cancer, malignancy that lives in the body.
Separation,
really look at that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Really look at that. Exactly. That's so beautiful, because I love that when you talk about people who have like thousands of years of a story, of a lived reality, of ancestry, of heritage, of like land being taken away, like things happening that were real, that have become part of identity. But how powerful is the psychedelic experience then for being able to get us past that barrier, right? That would take us like 100 years to like start to work through in a peaceful way. But here's a way to kind of springboard into, actually on this one level, we're the same. Like you and I have experienced this in the ER, let's say, and this is a very famous ER episode from back in, when the early seasons of ER, right? Right? It's like, I don't know if you watched
George
it.
Clooney.
Yes, exactly. Anthony Edwards, George Clooney.
Eyebrows.
You see these situations where in Chicago, right, it's the South Side, there's a policeman that just came in and he's been shot. And the person who shot him, who's a gangbanger, also comes in. And the whole episode is about, this ethical question that some of the characters start to have, like they start to judge one and support the other. And there's like a really real clear understanding is like, it doesn't matter when you're dying, when your body is, injured and in distress, and when you're injured. I think, your animal body is injured. We forget those things. We leave those to the side, because then it becomes about what's the most correct action. What's the most judicious thing to do? When you have limited resources, how do you parse them out between the deserving and the not? And those are some of the biggest questions that, people who are Médecins Sans Frontières, like all these, Red Cross, everybody who's going to all of these hotspots right now. And in some ways, resource constraint is something that Americans are not used to thinking about. But we're already seeing, like Cuba just went into a situation where there's going to be zero electricity. There's no transportation, just this weekend. So like we have actual literal cities having to then imagine the resource constraints, right? Of not being able to provide just the basic clean water, things like that. So it's like, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, there's so much that weighs on this practice of connection. This weighs on this practice of really having each other, witnessing each other, and working at that deep conscious level. Where can it take us? And I'm hopeful. I am hopeful in the long picture of things. There's hope always in even despair. It's when we lose that connection, when we isolate, when we really run away, avoid, that trauma response, which is such a natural response to have. But when you really, knowing that this is trauma happening right now, knowing that my trauma response will be to run away, what can I change now? What's the pathway that I can create now before I have to, result from that usual pathway that I would take?
And just that thought, right? Just that thought that I want to open up a new possibility signals to your own brain, and a new neuronal pathway does get opened up, right? BDNF does get excreted because there's uncertainty, there's a question, just even on that level. And we are, even in like, as we say in ketamine, one of the most common things people say is like, oh, what did you notice? It's like, oh, I have these triggers. And usually what I notice after I've had my ketamine therapy, or I'm feeling, I've had a few sessions, is that I get a little space between my trigger and response. Yeah. Right? Just to think for a second, okay, do I have a different thought I can have right now? I can see what's happening. I know why it's happening. And that's that crossing between the mind and a knowing, and the way of knowing that's called embodiment, right? Because I know I'm safe. I'm sitting in my office. I'm just working, and yet I'm having a trauma response because I saw something on my phone or somebody mentioned something, right? And I can feel my heart racing, and I can feel my palms getting sweaty. And what I think we're doing with these psychedelics is just slowing down that trauma response just enough to allow that alternate pathway to build up enough time, so that when that starts to happen, you have this alternate pathway, this other thought. And I feel like that's another piece. And the other thing that I will say in response is, I think we have a fallacy in the way we think about the future, which is that we think that it's all linear, right? Things get destroyed, oh, we're going to have to rebuild, and it's all going to be just like one foot in front of the other. But actually, reality is not linear. It's a spiral, right? And one of the most interesting things about the mathematics of like the Fibonacci spiral, right, is that you could do the same habit like for 6 days in a row, right, and almost feel like you didn't see any change. But on the 7th day, something will happen, and that shift will happen, right? And we see that with ketamine therapy too, right? It's like, you do it, you have a little pump, and then you get to a certain level. And we know that in our nervous system, there's something such as an action potential. We know that the human body works in that kind of threshold ways. And so that's the other piece that I'll tell people is like, sometimes when we're working on something, it just feels like nothing is moving. Just putting one foot in front of the other, And then all of a sudden, especially I see people who like my son, he plays drums. So he'll notice this. He's like, I'm just practicing, and I'm doing this. And then all of a sudden it clicks and it works. And I'm like, that's it, So what did you learn from that? Oh, I just got to practice. Okay, and just trust, right? And just trust. And that difficulty is not a problem. Difficulty is actually pointing you in the direction of what you need to work on. And I love that, about kids is you can really talk to them about what's it like to just try something and not be against yourself. Right? Adults, sometimes we're so against ourselves.
Can you say that again?
Yeah. What's it like to try something and not be against yourself, but instead be for yourself? Right? Because adults will be like, oh, I tried, but it didn't work. Right? And that's the core of depression. When we say that to ourselves over and over again, it becomes kind of like an identity. You don't even know you're doing it.
It's so amazing to talk to you because there's so many layers. You're so vivid in your language, and yet precise, and also very, very, like I said, layered of all kinds of metaphors and insights. I think it's just, and you get it. There's this part of what you just spoke about, which was that threshold or whatever number, whatever you call it. I call it kind of liminal, and I know you like liminal.
Yeah,
liminal is where we get into this state of transition and where things start to change. And maybe the human condition's story is 500,000 years old. Right. And we're just in some part of that.
Yeah.
Because we're just that big and small at the same time.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Absolutely. And I love how we can, see that story from that scale as well. And that brings like the humility of like, yeah, I don't know everything and I don't have all the answers. And I know that I've tried this and I've tried that and it hasn't worked. But it's like, you know, like it's a matter of what we see our patients work towards, which is like trusting themselves, trusting reality, trusting that they have what they need, that they can gather, what they can call to, what needs to happen. So I love this work for, you know, creating those containers where we can step into a different way of being. Because I feel like our everyday mind, our default mind, is a constant state of suspicion, a constant state of defense, right? It's like, who's saying what?
Well, only because I think it becomes that way. It becomes that way, and it doesn't have to be. And we have to really think about, why is that? What happens in that switch? What happens in that switch in adolescence when it becomes like, I can't do it. I don't want to. I can't. No one knows me. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, and then before that, just before that, there was like, oh, yeah. Oh, no, that's cool. That's neat. You know, that the child just switches. But what is that?
I mean, you know, you talk about on the neurobiological level, there's like a period of openness and creativity and like, what do you call it? Critical periods of learning, right? Yeah. And then there's the pruning, right? That happens in that late adolescent and early adulthood. So be careful what you prune down to, right?
And what you need to re-prune again.
Exactly. What did you cut off that shouldn't have been cut off? And that it's sometimes an unconscious process and not a conscious process. And
so pruning correlates to trauma or not?
So that's an interesting situation because it's like, what is being pruned, what is not being reinforced is being pruned away. So I think if somebody grew up with a lot of trauma in their life, sometimes what they'll do in their younger life, what you see in the young psyche is it kind of splits off, dissociates, right? And kind of just minimizes that trauma in some way just to be able to have a sense of self that's healthy. And then when they grow up and the pruning occurs, there's a question now, okay, which one do I prune off, right? Am I this good person or am I the person that the trauma happened to? And if they don't have language or a place, and that's why sometimes when people go to college and they suddenly have a chance to kind of explore themselves, and that's when sometimes the collapse can happen because all of a sudden, I don't know who I am and I don't have anything to kind of, you know, to hold on to. Psychically, especially because in those two parts can't talk to each other. Like, for example, if there's so much shame and guilt and trauma between those two parts, they can't talk. They don't have a conversation. They come out in ways where it's like, you know, firefighter responses, like maybe some outward ways or some inward damaging ways, right? So
is this what the world is experiencing right now?
Yeah. Dissociation? Yes. That's exactly it.
Is it the switch between, because we were like this and then we're like this and something is being pruned away because of our conditions and the world? And what brings us back to that? What brings us back to ourselves? What will bring back this planet to its sense of self?
Yeah. You know, we only respond to real consequences. And I think the real consequences are becoming more and more real, right? So we know that what we're...
Do you mean we're only responding in fear? We only
Not fear. I think survival. You know, like I think survival... I mean, think about it. Every psychedelic journey that is good for you is going to start with a really difficult aspect where you will either feel humbled, you know, because you've done ayahuasca and you're puking and you're going to the bathroom at the same time. And you just feel like an earthworm at that point because that's what you are on the scale that the medicine takes you to. Or you're going to be shown suffering, immense suffering, like eons of humanity suffering, and be shown that actually this is what humanity has always been about. You know, that's where the yin and yang of all of it exists. It's just like suffering and transcendence kind of have to coexist.
Okay, so if we're intelligent enough to know this as beings, we're intelligent enough to know this right now, that trauma is happening, what's real, what's not real. You know, who is who, who's the victim and who's the perpetrator. We know this right now. And do we respond in this way?
You just brought up this huge piece of what dissociation is about. And greater minds than mine, Harvey Schwartz, one of them, have talked about dissociative identity disorder, trauma, and this victim, perpetrator, and accomplice kind of triangle, right? and how each of us at any time can be in any of those three perspectives, right? We can be the victim as well as the perpetrator, and how sometimes part of it is the theater of relational healing can sometimes evoke that we all have those aspects within us, which is where psychedelic healing gets really interesting, is, for example, like these stories. So there's this story of, I think you're right. I think you're onto something with the dissociation because of how much trauma everybody's experiencing right now. More patients with dissociation are approaching psychedelic therapy. And I do believe there is a way to balance and maybe even learn from the patients who live in harmony in dissociation, have been able to harmonize the dissociative parts. That has a lot to teach the rest of us. I think I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Well, I'm particularly intrigued by that, by what's happening in that psychedelic experience that you're describing as a healing benefit.
Yeah.
Is it a question of consciousness? Because it's an altered state of consciousness that you get to. Is it a state of altered consciousness? Should we, person to person, human to be human, thinking about consciousness versus the material trauma?
I think it's both, I think it's like you can't separate the two. How does connecting with the greater consciousness, for example, heal our trauma? I think that's the question you're asking, is
Yes.
How does, that connection? And I think greater minds than mine have written about it. And I think we're seeing it, right? I think, first of all, is there evidence of it? I think there is evidence, especially like the Johns Hopkins trials from Roland Griffiths were the first to demonstrate that, those who found the greatest benefit to their treatment-resistant depression from one dose of psilocybin were the ones that described it as being a mystical experience or one of the top 5, greatest, more significant experiences of their life. And so those are like, when a child is born, right? Or you get married, like those are some big experiences in our life, or you graduated, right? So these experiences that heal us are at the level of these peak experiences, and that peak experiences have something for us, something that we can gain from. And I think the way we live, the people who are chasing peak experiences, whether physical or emotional or intellectual, are always growing, are always evolving, are more resilient in the way that you've said. So there's something about mystical and peak experiences that does something for us in organizing ourselves, right? So
Yeah. And what are the coping mechanisms during that, in that resiliency? In addition to that sense of compassion that can be shared, or empathy or connection, or that connection of unity and external and internal unity, and in that mystical process of psychedelics that you can heal, but you can actively heal it.
Yeah.
You don't have to wait.
Yeah.
We can talk about healing right now as a planet. Go to your neighbor, go to your friend, go to somebody you don't know, and have a talk and connect at whatever consciousness level we can connect at.
That's it. And that's I think the part that we talk about in integration is like bring that cosmic, the thing that's kind of ethereal to the material, right? How do you capture the thing that's happening kind of within you and inside you and make it come outwards? Well, we know that the mind is embodied. The changes in the mind will eventually show up in the body. You can't help it. It's like, oh, you healed your trauma from, sexual abuse, and now you walk differently in your body because you're more comfortable maybe. And that makes a difference to how your day goes, your energy flows, how you take care of yourself, and how you can then kind of protect yourself also against further trauma. Because trauma is another one of those things that works on the same Fibonacci spiral, which is that, the more accumulations and you hit an end, right? Like, so the football players, NHL, right? Like, why did it take the NFL? Why did it take them so long to become stricter about imaging all the CTE, right? What's the word for it? Chronic, brain fibrosis and kind of basically an inflammatory condition of the brain that is a chronic inflammation that affects the connectivity and creates conditions for Parkinson's and dementia and early death in some of these athletes, right?
Pruning, extensive pruning,
Right.
too much pruning.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Simi. This is such an engaging, healing conversation, because here I was sitting before this podcast thinking about what can I do to distract myself right now from the news? I can do my taxes. I can sit here and go through my account, the bills, and I was so distraught inside. I could feel it in my body. I could feel this because I've been carrying this and feeling this from patients and myself and families and what we're hearing in the news.
Yeah. You said something. Yeah. You said something, carrying, right? Carrying.
Yeah.
So that's the thing that we are becoming aware of, is that we are all carrying something. Carrying. And what do you want to be carrying? Do you want to be carrying the news? Do you want to be carrying the way you're feeling? And when we get to carry it, what can we do with it? Right?
Yeah. So I'm going to ask the audience, what are you carrying?
What are you carrying? So I would say that I think one of the ways in which we can get around to that question of what are you carrying is, let me help you carry it. Let me carry it with you. Let us both carry what we're carrying together alongside, right? So there's like that alignment, connection, alignment. Let me make space for you to describe what you're carrying. One of the things that I love is art making. And I was just seeing that, the great artist Monet, when he became so old that he couldn't paint, they would just give him paper and scissors. And he would just cut these beautiful large shapes, and then he would just put them up on the walls. And I think like creativity, right? Like as simple as just scissors and colored paper. It's not complicated, but it's about describing your experience in all these different ways.
So that we can see each other.
Yeah. So some of the things that I was going to bring to our, first retreat is like...
Mindwala is starting retreat.
So
yeah. I hope the audience knows that the Too Curious MD is a collaboration of Mindwala, LLC. This is Simi and I's last year. I think it was last year, June, right? Yeah. June 2025, we signed an agreement on Mindwala and brought in Pala medicine with shamans. Yeah. And it is about the mind and the wala, the people. Mindwala means mind people. I'm a person of mind, Mindwala.
Love that. And I know that this is something that has deep meaning for you. And I think that is also, kind of bringing out some of the threads that we have in our retreat. But, I think a retreat can be built in all sorts of different ways. There's no one size fits all, but I think there are elements that we have both learned from all the different retreats and the different trainings that we've done, where there are some best practices, right, of how to hold a retreat. There's set and setting, there's altar building, there's bringing in creative materials, there's kind of even bringing in the idea of, what do you call it, like bringing fire and earth and wind and water and the different elements. And I really want to focus in on this idea of embodiment and how what our whole conversation has kind of led to, okay, there's changes, there's things, there's transformation. How do you make it real? How do you make it material, right? Like you just said. There's this great book by Jack Cornfield where he talks about after the ceremony, the laundry, right? Right. It's very humbling. It's like after the ceremony, the laundry.
Yeah, great.
So what's your laundry, right? Like, what are you trying to wash?
Well, it's like you've done this beautiful work, this beautiful ceremony, and now comes
here's the laundry. Here's the real part, and that's
here's
as important, if not more important. And I love that, part of what I've learned and what we've learned from a lot of all the people that we've been learning from, all of these mentors, is just that you have to walk the walk, right? You have to do it for your own healing, so that you can bring that to others. And I think on this healer's path is where I think things kind of become more powerful. Like what comes towards you is what's meant for you, right? Like you think back to the challenges you've had in this last couple of years, people lost, like some of the trauma that has happened to your clinic, right? Let's bring that up and how you held it. You held that.
Yeah. I can still cry.
Yeah. And you got to let that go, right? Not go, but you've got to honor it, and you've got to acknowledge it. And I think there were beautiful lessons at the time that we talked about that I think really, bears repeating. Yeah.
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 Some of the greatest art and some of the greatest work and some of the greatest poetry and the greatest literature, plays really speak to this beauty within despair and the healing that happens right there in that little drop between beauty and despair.
Oh my gosh.
There's a little drop, and there's an opportunity, and seeking that opportunity and seeing that. So Mindwala is our attempt at building connection with ourselves, with our people, with people who are curious, of course, because you got to be curious. And I hope this becomes more of a movement, and there are so many more people who are doing this as well. And so connecting with those groups and,
Absolutely. I think you and I bring this lens of narrative medicine. We've done narrative medicine workshops.
Yeah.
We've done the body maps of emotion. We've, read poetry, done writing, made art. And I think all those pieces, right, have really informed how a retreat of this kind, for example, really needs a little bit of structure, right? Like that ability to flow between structure and openness. It's like we're building something together. But, just talking about how like people like Joe, for example, Joe Tafur, medicine man on both the Western as well as the indigenous, lineages, is bringing together both sides, and doing such great work. So I'm just really excited to talk to all these different people. And then also, I think for healers, like the question is, well, what's your work, right?
Yeah.
On that level of like, okay, in 5, 10, 15 years, where do you want to say you were coming from, or where were you going, and how do you evaluate that? And I think that's really powerful. Actually, the notes I wrote to myself about this have to do with how you say speak into your intentions. Like you say, you say that. You say into.
Okay.
You say the word into quite a bit. Yeah.
Oh.
You're like, can you speak to or speak into? And at first, I was just like a little taken back about that, because I was like, oh, that's because, when we talk about things, it's like in a paragraph in a formalized way. But when you say into, it's like, oh, no, it's active. It's right here. Right?
Yeah.
And that's a really nice way, because when I thought about this, I was like, okay, when you bring together this individual to collective consciousness in a group, you've got that identity shift. Now, all 4 people are kind of connected, all these different layers. And I was even thinking of this like way of weaving that we have, of bringing together like safety, protection, alliance, and then that purpose leading to speaking your intention, right? But I think this is kind of like invocation. The word is invocation, invoke, right? Just like you say right? Into, invoke, meaning like wake it up, bring it out of something, like, the power to bring into being. And so I think it's intuitive spell casting. I really think it's on some level putting your intention strongly into words. And we've heard our patients say this over and over again, right? It's how deeply you've thought about your intention, how strong it is, and how badly you want it. I remember Richard Woods saying that so crystal clear, right? He was like, no, you got to really want it. You can't just be a casual intention. And I think he's right about it, because it has to do with creativity, and how that's unlocked.
That's why Bad Bunny is so popular right now.
Absolutely. These kids are onto something. All these kids, like, follow your passion. Follow your passion and trust and be yourself, right? Like, he is so himself. It's like the biggest.
So himself and so amazing. Like, draws in so many people. Has drawn in so much
the most
curiosity.
Well-loved character on this planet beyond, right? Like,
who's worried about being shot, though?
Yeah. And that's the sad part. But showing us, right? So I think these young people, this cohort of kids that, are growing up right now, are really learning on this other level that they're powerful and magical. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that we are living in this liminal space right now, where that shift is happening. Like, time is going by in a different way. There are more possibilities. There's an acceleration. It's the year of the fire horse. There's a moment of shift, And so when you speak powerfully into a powerful moment, those two things can only multiply and amplify, right?
Yeah.
So I really am kind of...
I just got an idea of the logo. Do it. The background is got to be a fire horse, and this, the colors all have to be, like your hair a little bit with more red though.
I like it. I like it.
And it's got to this flow, and that's going to be our logo. And it's going to because it's the year of invoking. And this year, and every year, Mindwala will change its logo because based on what that calling will be for that year.
I like it.
Or that period of time. So invoke is the year of the fire horse.
Yeah.
And Mindwala is here.
Let's do it.
To stay. 50 episodes and going.
And going. Thank you so much. This has been really fun.
Thanks for joining us on the Two Curious MD podcast. We hope today's episode inspired you to ask new questions and explore fresh perspectives. We challenge you to ask us those unasked questions that you're curious about in your medical practice, condition, health, and wellness.
If you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to subscribe, share it with somebody just as curious, and leave us a review. It helps us keep the curiosity alive. Post or comment with a question or curious inquiry that you have and seek to explore or learn with us. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.